Hi. Fraud risk is a key component of the enterprise risk. No company exists without a fraud risk. The success of the company would depend on how effectively the fraud risk is managed. In this video series, we will be looking at how we can approach architecting a fraud risk management framework in an organization. Particularly, we'll be looking at, particularly in this video, we'll be looking at some of the concepts and the maturity models that are available. Considering that it is a long topic to cover, we will see it in three parts. The first part is what we will cover today on concepts. The second part, in another video, we'll be looking at the implementation side of it. And in the third part, we'll be taking the payroll function as an example and then see how the concept of FRM and all that we had studied can be practically applied. Let's start with part 1. In part 1, the first thing that we will see is to cover some of the basics. Any fraud, when you take the topic of fraud, one thing that you will always hear is the concept of fraud triangle, which is basically for a fraud to exist, these three things have to be present. These three attributes have to be present. One is, the first thing is the motivation, meaning a requirement to commit a fraud. It could be a financial requirement, it could be a status requirement, or it could be driven for any greed. It could be driven by, let's say a particular want or a particular overspending. The motivation can be varying. The another motivation can be like, I deserve it. So this is the deserving motivation. Right? It's the feeling that I deserve more than what I am getting. Right? So that also could be one of the motivation. And the second most important aspect is rationalization. So rationalization is part of it's called as a fraud triangle, wherein the individual would justify why he or she is committing a fraud. Like I just now mentioned, I deserve more is one key component of rationalization. The third aspect is the opportunity, meaning it is just not enough that I have a need, which is the motivation, and I am not doing anything wrong, that is rationalization. For a fraud to happen, there needs to be an opportunity, meaning an internal control weakness. The moment there is an internal control weakness with adequate motivation and a very strong rationalization, a fraud is committed. Now, if we look at the integrity triangle, it's just the opposite. Right? So, compared to fraud, integrity is where upholding of values and ethical requirements, upholding of ethical and value requirements. It has three components. This also has three components: the accountability, authority, and responsibility. Now, to strengthen integrity, there will have to be an adequate accountability along with the authority to enforce and the responsibility to perform a particular task. It is very important to understand the different components of fraud triangle and integrity triangle to give an idea as to why and how a fraud happens, and then why and how can the integrity be upholded. Let us look at some of the fraud risk management components. The first thing is governance, which is shown at the top. As we saw in the previous slide, the top management or the senior management upholding the integrity triangle or upholding integrity is just not a theoretical concept, but walking the talk is the most important component when we look at FRM. Because if the top management is ethical, then the rationalization aspect comes down to that extent. The second component of a fraud risk management is risk assessment. So this is where the fraud risk control matrix come into picture. We are going to see some of the approaches towards it. And the key component that differentiates a regular control metrics assessment or a regular control metrics approach to a fraud risk control metrics approach is the attitude of a fraudster. Is to have a fraudster mindset, and then, okay, this is the process, this is the existing controls. If I am going to do a fraud, if I am motivated and if I am rationalizing a fraud, can I do this fraud? And can this fraud be detected with the controls and what control needs to be put in place to address this? So that's more of a difference between a regular risk assessment and a fraud risk assessment, fraud risk control matrix. The third important component is control activities. Now, having understood the risks, what control activities would basically address that risk? It can be designing a control, and the most important thing in fraud, which differentiates a fraud from a regular risk assessment, is training and awareness. Training to tell them that look out for fraud signals and then be aware of it. Awareness is kind of more to do with, look, if something is going wrong, we will have adequate resources to find that. So the fear of getting caught is a significant demotivator. The next component is investigation, which is the root cause analysis, who is the fraud actor, the entry point, and then modus operandi loop back. Now, this is important because once we have understood how the fraud has taken place, it is very important to trace back the steps and then look at various lapses in the control that has happened and then take actions to address those root cause. Unless and until the root cause is addressed, we are actually not doing any improvements to the process to address the fraud risk. Monitoring. Now, obviously, this is a key component that will encompass the other fraud risk management components, which is basically measuring the outcome and then more importantly is to keep invested. Right. So we are going to look at some of the challenges that we have that we can face when the FRM is being implemented. But one key thing is to ensure that the senior management, the leaders of the organization keep invested on keeping this FRM alive. These are some of the high level components that we can see in a FRM. Let us look at some of the maturity models that are available. Now, the first maturity model, meaning the initial stage an organization would see, is basically ad hoc, which is basically not documented, and the changes are left, right, and center. There is no controlled way of looking at changes to a process, changes to activities, and those are not documented, and the fraud risks are not documented and addressed. These are like ad hoc stage. The second key stage is taking those baby steps. The organization being made risk aware, but these are managed in silos, meaning say a procurement does not talk to payment. When I say does not talk to, it's not looked into in entirety. It's just managed in silos. Each one have their own formats. Each one have their own ways of working, and the approach is reactive. It is not proactive. It is reactive. When a fraud happens, then the entire organization jumps up and down saying what happened, who was doing what, why it was not uncovered before, blah, 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 blah. Those are like reactive organization, and we can put them under the initial setup in the FRM maturity model. The third important thing, the third stage of the maturity is whether it is repeatable. Wherein at this stage, the organization has a defined and documented process with clear roles and responsibilities as to who has to do what, and the process and the changes to the process are clearly documented, are clearly made aware. There is a history of changes that is available. There is a version control that is available. This is the third stage of the maturity model. The fourth thing is where it is managed well, meaning fraud risk is given a key consideration when drafting the process, when reviewing the process, when updating the process. At that stage, we can say that fraud risk management is adequately integrated into the processes. And the last maturity model, in the maturity model, the best or the top position is when is what is called as a leadership, where the risk tolerance as to how much of a risk that the organization can tolerate is established and it is reviewed. Now you can say that why should we have any tolerance at all? Any organization cannot have 100% risk under control or 100% risk that it can manage. It's just impossible. Right? There will be an amount of acceptable risk. There will be an amount of a risk that will be left open, but is it within those tolerance limit? That evaluation is performed, and if that evaluation is performed and it is reviewed consistently, it is benchmarked, then we can say that the FRM of that organization is at the leadership position. Let us look at some of the components, and I mean, on the left you will see that these are the various components, and on the right you will see these are the various maturity models. We will try to link these two. We will try to see some examples. It is going to be a busy slide, so I will zoom in, zoom out for your benefit. The first component that we saw is governance, which is shown at the top. We saw the integrity triangle. Let us look at how this is managed at various stages. In an ad hoc manner, meaning the ad hoc stage, there is minimal or no engagement from leadership. There is no formal risk management policies, and it is more of a reactive culture. And when the organization takes the baby steps, the fraud risk management is acknowledged, but it is but inconsistent involvement of the leadership. There are good policies available, but those are not enforced. There is a slight awareness of ethical behavior during the initial stages, but it is not given much of an importance. But when we look at the managed stage of the maturity, we can see that the leadership is very actively engaged in FRM. The policies are well defined, communicated. There is a proactive culture and strong ethical environment. As you know, this is on governance, which is shown at the top. At a leadership, when the maturity model is at the leadership stage, then the leadership champions FRM and it is integrated into strategy. This is a key aspect. The moment FRM gets its place as part of strategy discussions, at that stage we can call that this organization is at a leadership position as far as the maturity model is concerned. Now that it will be the policies are advanced, dynamic and fully integrated, and the ethical culture is deeply ingrained into it in its core values. When this happens, we can say that the governance in the organization is at a leadership stage. The second one is risk assessment, wherein we saw that the fraud risk control management and the fraudster mindset and how having a fraudster mindset is key. When it is ad hoc, there is no consideration of a fraudster mindset. There is no formal fraud risk control matrix. FRCM is fraud risk control matrix. But when the organization is taking a baby steps, we can see that at the initial stage, there is basic awareness of the need to consider. Initial steps are done to identify fraud risk, but there is no comprehensive framework. At the third stage, which is the managed stage, we can see that the organization would actively consider, and a structured approach to FRA with a detailed fraud risk control matrix is available. This is optimal. The managed stage is considered as an optimal stage. Leadership, where this particular this risk assessment, the fraud risk assessment, is deeply integrated. Now, when new businesses are done, when new processes are established, the fraudster psychology is looked at. Where there is scenario analysis and behavioral cues are looked at, and these attitudes or behaviors of fraudsters and always being on the lookout for possible frauds is aligned with business objectives and regularly refined. It is just not looking at one time, looking at the process and then say, okay, this is where it is, and are we happy with it? No, it is being looked at. It is when it's being looked at it on a regular basis and it is refined. If we look at the next component, which is the control activities, in an ad hoc, controls are ad hoc. It's kind of largely manual. As we have seen, it is reactive. It is compliance focused. Say, for example, delegation of authority metrics is there, which will basically define, okay, and the controls will basically focus on, let's say, a DOA compliance or a particular policy compliance. It just looks at one component of the process, and that's it, right? And there is no training with little fraud risk awareness among employees. Employees don't look at fraud risk as a consideration when they are interacting, when they are looking at numbers, when they are looking at processes. Whereas in initial stage, when the organization is taking the baby steps, there is proactive controls, but what lacks is the consistency. They are not consistently applied or integrated. Now, training is kind of limited to compliance rather than focus on fraud. Whether a DOA is adhered to, policy is adhered to, the training is more than that. In a way, fraud becomes a dirty word to use when trainings are there. Fraud becomes a word that is not comfortably spoken of whenever there are trainings, whenever there are discussions on processes among the employees. Fraud does not become a natural conversation to have. In a managed setup, we can see that the proactive controls are well designed and the focus is on preventing fraud and integrated with data analytics. DEA is data analytics. Now, there are comprehensive training programs tailored to different roles within the organization when the maturity model is managed. When it is at a leadership stage, we can say that the controls are cutting edge. It incorporates artificial intelligence, machine learning with focus on innovation and adaptability. Fraud no longer becomes a taboo word to be used. Fraud becomes the topic of fraud, the risk of fraud becomes a day-to-day conversation, not in a negative sense, but in a sense that they are comfortable talking about fraud. And there is a culture of continuous learning with ongoing interactive awareness. And the key thing that would differentiate an organization from managed, that would leap an organization from managed to leadership, is obviously the support by leadership. Explicit, clear support from leadership to FRM is what would differentiate an organization from managed to leadership. The next is investigation and root cause analysis. In an ad hoc setup, there is no fraud investigation unit. There is no specific fraud investigation unit. Only when there is a major fraud, then people will start jumping up and down saying, why was this not identified? Leadership will come back and say, what was internal audit doing? What was risk management doing? And all that. It is reactive, right? And then little follow up on outcomes. When that fraud is detected, there is a lot of sensationalization saying that, okay, this is the largest fraud the organization has seen. And that's it. It becomes company-wide news for, few days, and that's it. Everyone forgets and then goes back to their business. There are no loop back of lessons learned. However, in the initial stage, there is an FIU. There is a fraud investigation unit that operates according to documented policies and procedures. There is some corrective action, but there is no systemic approach. There are structured investigation report, but it lacks depth and strategic insight. Right? There are some reports that are given, but it's not looking at root cause from a holistic standpoint and then taking corrective actions. When it comes to managed, which is optimal, there is a clearly defined purpose and role for FIU. Lessons learned are feeding into risk management and control improvements. The root cause analysis is performed and it is leading to strategic improvements. But in leadership, the FIU members are equipped, meaning there is investment that is made into the FIU units with advanced tools and methodologies. And as I was telling before, it is fully supported by leadership, which is the key aspect that would differentiate these organizations. And then the investigation outcomes are integrated into the strategy. The other aspect that would basically differentiate an organization from managed to leadership is when we talk about fraud during strategy discussions. The moment we do that, we know that the maturity of the FRM in the organization has matured from being just managed to gaining leadership. The last aspect is monitoring, which is measuring outcome, keep kind of investing. In an ad hoc model, there is no formal monitoring. Issues are addressed only when they arise. Results are rarely reported or communicated beyond immediate teams. It's kept as a secret. No, the organization feels that if a fraud of a particular department is kind of made aware to the other departments, then it might lead to a negative, say, a sentiment about the organization, etc. But by communicating the frauds and making them aware, it gives a message that organization is looking at it very, very seriously. And that's something which organizations in the ad hoc form miss. And when an organization takes baby steps, it is reactive, it is not proactive, and it's not fully integrated. And inconsistent reporting and very less actionable insights. But in managed, it becomes proactive and structured. It is integrated, clear and consistent reporting with actionable insights. Of course, when it comes to leadership, then we have dynamic and continuous monitoring. It is fully integrated, transparent, strategic reporting. This is the key thing, right? When it is transparent, fraud no longer becomes a dirty word. It is transparent, strategic reporting that drives decision making and demonstrates value. Right? So overall, when we look at the maturity model, you can see that ad hoc is where the organization wants to do something, but they don't know how to go about it, so they are being reactive. Initial is when the organization becomes a bit more serious about it, tries to engage in professionals to perform this activity, to come up with maybe a fraud risk control matrix, or look at it fraud with bit more seriousness, but it lacks conviction. When it is managed, there is conviction, the leadership is engaged, leadership is made very much aware of the pitfalls if the fraud risk is not adequately or actively managed, but they are not fully committed. They want to have it. Maybe there is a compliance requirement. Maybe they want to demonstrate to the world that they are taking, in fact, the fraud risks seriously. But down below, they know that it's just a tick in the box. It becomes leadership when the leadership is fully committed. When the leadership themselves take those steps to ensure that the fraud risk is given its due importance. This is at a very high level how the components, which is the governance, risk management activities, investigation and monitoring, can be mapped to ad hoc. Now, as a takeaway from this, you can look into your organizations, you can look into your clients' organizations and see where do they form. And then you can suggest or recommend what are the actions that the organization need to take to move from, let's say, an ad hoc to, let's say, initial. It can only be step by step. From ad hoc, you should not expect to take leadership. It will only result in burnout. From ad hoc, it can be a 3-4 quarters or a 1 year, 2 year plan to bring to initial, and from there to manage, and from there to leadership. Manage to leadership is a huge, it will take more time than bringing in from ad hoc to managed. If say ad hoc to manage is going to take some, let's say 2 years, from managed to leadership, it's going to take even more time, because the leadership will have to be fully committed. There are investments that is also required, and the leadership should be open for those investments as well. This concludes the first part. We will look at second part in a subsequent video, where we will look at some of the methodologies for developing the fraud risk control matrix. We are going to look at bottom-up approach, top-down approach. We will look at key challenges that we will see when FRM is implemented and what are the possible solutions. We will also look at leveraging technology in part 2. And of course, in part 3, we're going to look at the payroll function and then see how FRM can be managed there. Thank you.